It's wonderful to be here this morning. You know, it's just so great to come to Sankofa. I always enjoy coming to Sankofa. I always say when I'm in Philadelphia that when I come to Sankofa, I come to the best school in the United States of America. You can't go to school in the United States of America and get a coherent understanding of the African American experience without somehow touching base with the culture, the experiences of people who have created the very fabric of the American society. And Sankofa has tried to do that better than anybody else. And I think that this is the place always for other schools that are trying to create Afrocentric schools. They really need to come to Sankofa. I want to thank Dr. Freya Rivers for the organization of this conference, for her staff, for actually the young people who have demonstrated this morning that really you can just get rid of Ritalin. You don't have to have Ritalin if you're going to understand how to deal with the question of culture and energy. I mean, and the whole notion of the relationship that young people have to activity. I mean, they have just demonstrated all kinds of wonderful things here this morning. Okay, I only have 25 minutes, and that's why I'm trying to talk fast. So I hope y'all don't mind that I'm talking fast. I am, of course, always honored to be in the presence of my mentors and colleagues who have also contributed a lot to who I am and what I have done and what I try to do. And you will hear more from them. I want to say that coming to Sankofa, however, and seeing many of my friends from other places, it's almost like telling Anansi's stories to Anansi's children. I mean, you already know these stories that I'm going to tell, but we're going to tell them anyway because it's important that we sort of try to keep them in mind. My presentation on Afrocentricity and curriculum begins from the beginning and with the with terminology. And I just want to do a 25-minute or 30-minute workshop here on this, and then I will be finished with my part of it. I have put on the board here for you some ideas that you normally already that you already know or you've seen. And I just want to talk briefly about them so you will have, we will be on the same, at least in the same book on this subject. The term Afrocentricity is not a bad term. It's a very useful term. In fact, it is a very positive concept and a very positive idea. For 500 years, African people were moved off of terms, physical terms, political terms, cultural terms, historical terms. We were just moved out of place. We moved off of our place, off of our territory, off of our terms, off of our intellectual space. And when you move somebody off of their own intellectual terms and intellectual space, you create a dislocated person. You create people who are dislocated. And the idea behind Afrocentricity was the notion of recentering African children and African people, because we're talking education today. If you notice, for example, the young people here this morning, and you saw those of you who for the first time haven't seen this, to see the young people doing African dance and using African drums in school. In the United States of America, it's only recently, since the Afrocentric movement, that we have had that. And that's because the Afrocentrists in education understood that African children responded, just like any other children, to their cultural elements that were responsible for the way they learn and the way they live in society. So we understood that. And fundamentally, we used to say all the time, you have glee clubs in school, you have chess clubs. What's wrong with having African American children having a drum ensemble in school? And we couldn't get the schools to do that. They didn't understand it. No, we were going, because the idea was that the dislocated children who were out of place and were participating in an educational system which had not been designed for African children at all, because it was designed for European males initially, of course, if you go back to the 17th century. So the idea was, since it was designed that way, how do you create a system where you have African children as subjects within their own historical experiences? That is, to recenter African children so that they operate from a standpoint where they are not simply seen as the renters of someone else's information or someone else's knowledge, but where they are the owners of information and the owners of knowledge. You can't come into Sankofa, Shule, and not realize that these children own this knowledge. They own these drums. They own this African dance. They own the Zulu declaration. They feel a sense of ownership. And in other schools throughout this nation, African children sit in the schools as guests, even if the schools are all black. You can go to urban community, black teachers, and in the urban communities, and if the schools are not Afrocentric, the information is information that is in a way given as if our children are not even sitting in there. So if they're talking about social studies, our children are sitting in the classroom, but they are outside of the information. If they're talking mathematics, our children are sitting in the classroom, but they're outside of the mathematical history or experience. They don't even know that the very first books of mathematics were African books. You see? So you take an Afrocentric tool and say, okay, let's bring this home. Let's start from the beginning. So Afrocentric. Now you've seen the word Afrocentricity. We use Afrocentricity because Afrocentricity is a perfectly good word. And some people say, well, I don't want to use Afrocentricity, I want to use Afrocentricity. And this was a movement that was started initially by the African-American psychologists. And I don't understand all the reasons for it, but one of the reasons they say was because it had more of Africa in it. That you say Afri, and that way you have like Africa. Well, the early books that were written on Afrocentricity. And the notion behind Afro is also Africa. So it's not a conflict to say Afrocentricity, and in fact it is grammatically correct in terms of the whole business of etymology and the construction of new words. This is the way you form new words in the English language, and since we're using the English language with these words, that word is perfectly correct. In fact, Afrocentricity is incorrect. In fact, Africocentricity would be more correct than Afrocentricity. But anyway, that's it. So Afrocentricity is a perfectly good word. That's the other thing. African-centered and Africa-centered. I want to talk about that because that's the other thing you have. Some people who were a little nervous with Afrocentricity. Well, I'm a little nervous with that. We can't get that in our schools. We say Afrocentricity, people get upset. So we will say African-centered, or we going to say Africa-centered. Well, the thing is that African-centered is basically the same thing as Afrocentricity. But Africa-centered is more the geographical continent of Africa. And a lot of people say, well, when I don't believe in Afrocentricity, but I believe that we should be Africa-centered. And what they mean by that is almost a geographical notion that Africa is the center of the world and all things emerge from Africa and so on. And that may be a useful concept, but that's not what was meant when we first started talking about Afrocentric education. And that's not what we meant when we were talking about Afrocentricity. When I was talking about Afrocentricity in the very early, in the late 70s and the early 80s, the point that I was trying to make was that African people had to be viewed and must view themselves as agents in the world and as actors in the world. And everything we do and all information that we acquire, whether it's information in science, information in different parts of the world, we ought to view ourselves as agents in the world, as actors, and so forth. And so that becomes the fundamental basis of that. I'll explain it more. Let me have the next transparency. All right. Okay. So, yeah. Now, and some of the principles, you know these principles, 7 principles. I don't need to go through the 7 principles, but if you start talking about, if you talk about Afrocentricity, start talking about dealing with ourselves as agents, you have to understand that all things that we deal with in terms of concepts in the world come from somebody. They don't just come out of the sky. Human beings create them. I mean, if you wait around for something to come out of the sky, you'd be waiting around for a long time. Things don't come that way. The way things come, people create them. They organize them. Sometimes I talk to people in religions, and they assume that the religion just fell out of the sky. People create the rituals. They come up with the protocols of the religion. They write the manuals and the books for how you ought to practice. All these things happen because human beings create them. They don't just happen. And the same way it is when we start talking about how you deal with this question of agency in terms of Afrocentricity. This is the next one, please. So I have 25 minutes and I'm just trying to reach. All right. Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of Africological assumptions, and I guess there was a word I didn't explain, Africology, on the other page. The word Africology is an Afrocentric study of African phenomena. That's what it means. Africology, the Afrocentric study of African phenomena. Now, Africological assumptions, these are assumptions. And these are assumptions behind the education in terms of Afrocentric education and the curriculum. One of the assumptions is that there are elements of commonality in African cultures. And this is very important because what you saw this morning was a good demonstration of that. You saw young people who's told you, look, this boot dance, there are elements that come from South Africa, but we have remixed it with African American elements, and then they showed you a dance that had elements of funga from Liberia in it, and you said, wow, what's going on here? What's going on is that the African people recognize the commonality in African cultures, even though we recognize that there are distinct histories to all of our cultures. The African American, for example, we believe that in terms of the panoply of our great people, we say Harriet Tubman, we say Nat Turner, Marcus Garvey, and Malcolm, and so on. But the people in Brazil, the African Brazilians, claim Zumbi and Zumbaganga as great people in their history. The Haitians claim Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines and Boukman and so on. But these are specific histories of African people, but there are also commonalities in African cultures. And what we understood here by what our young people were doing this morning was this commonality. African-centeredness and interpretation. That means that if you were in a classroom and you were doing a lesson plan, that if you come across something like this comes out of a contemporary textbook on African American history that's used in many public schools. And it says that in the 1840s, white slave owners were having a problem with keeping with the slaves because they could not keep the slaves from running away. Now, this is, in this book, it calls itself an African American history book. Now, if you read something like that, you have to say, now, something is wrong with this interpretation. The real problem was the slave owners. They were the problem. The Africans were having a problem. It wasn't that the slave masters were having a problem. We were the ones who were having the problem. But I suspect that most of us, in terms of our lessons, we don't sometimes understand that. Even when we say, look, I am doing, and I have teachers to say this to me, you know, I am teaching about Africa, but I still can't get the children's attention. I can't get them interested in it. And then when you ask them what they're teaching, it's amazing. I went to one school. They had an African. They had a inside the classroom. They had constructed what the teacher told me was their African hut. Inside the classroom, the whole thing. And so I started to explain to her. She said, and the children just they don't like dealing with this African hut. And we worked a whole semester creating this African hut. I said, well, first of all, you shouldn't call it an African hut. Because number one, hut is an English word. Say, that's the first problem. Second problem is you can't equate it with the American notion of a house, particularly since you only have one of these so-called huts. And in Africa, if you had a compound, if you had something where you had a structure, a rendezvous structure that was used for bedrooms, one that you use for guests, another one you use for storage, and then you had some space out front for a living room where people just can assemble, and the kitchen is always outside in most places, at least. So if that's the case, then you can say you can have something that's equivalent to a house. But you can't give an African child an idea that this little structure you have in your classroom is what the African people live in, because they live in far more space than that. That is just a bedroom. That's where people sleep. So, but the notion, you see, the notion comes because you don't have an African-centeredness in your interpretation. It is just like when an African person tells you that such and such is my brother, and you assume that they come from the same mother, the same father. Well, they may, or they may very well be what we call in America first cousins. First cousins are brothers, and first cousins are sisters in the African kinship system, in most places. So the idea, again, is that we don't use African-centeredness in our interpretations, and we make mistakes. It's like the person who says, well, I don't understand why people in Africa, they leave food at the graves of the dead, because the dead can't eat. Well, in America, people leave flowers, and the dead can't smell. You know what I'm saying? So it is again where you place the evidence of the weight in terms of interpretation, and that's the main key, and that's the problem that happens to our children when they're in these classrooms. Connecting us to ancient classical civilization, all Afrocentric education has to be connected to ancient classical civilization. In fact, one of the best ways to look at this is that if you're going to talk about the history of any discipline, any field, you have to start at its origin if you're going to do that. And if you take any field, you just name it, mathematics, science, all kinds of science, astronomy, geometry, medicine, you start in the African base. That's fundamental. What we have received is a situation where in the West, they start you with the Greeks. But the Greeks are relatively young. They are recent in terms of ancient history. And so why start with the Greeks when you can start with the very origin of the civilization, and you go back to the ancient African people? I mean, I'm sure you will hear this more and more today, and I'm not going to deal with this. Gender sensitivity and complementarity, which is an aspect of the Afrocentric curriculum. The whole notion of the Afrocentric education, you saw it again, evidence with the young people. We have never, in the African history, in terms of our culture, if you go all the way back to the ancient Egyptians, when you saw the images often of the kings, you would see them right with the queens, right together, the male and female. This is very, very clear. It is only in the traditions of Europe where you began to see this utter domination of women.
It is not in the African tradition, not in our history, not in our cosmology. In fact, in the cosmology of Africa, you go back to it and you see even the creator, male and female. Many societies give you this same picture, Mawu and Lisa, for example. It's a fundamental aspect of the African understanding of cosmology, of the world, you see. Let me ask you this question. Can you even think of the name of a Roman woman? No, the reason I ask you that is because Rome considered the greatest giver of laws in history. Considered, the Europeans consider this, that Rome, that's right. I know that was one of my Maulana moments. but Rome considered a great civilization for law and order. They never named women. Women were not named, didn't have names. You were Julius's woman. You see? You were Augustus' woman. This is the way, that's the way the Romans did it. No names of women in Roman history. Rare. And if you find one, it's an exception which I can explain to you. You know what I'm saying? But it was never true in Africa. In Africa, you go all the way back and you find women in African history with names. You see? Because they were human. They were considered people. This is a fact. But so we gotta look at that. African origin civilization, we know that. The monogenetic origin of the human race. Don't let people try to confuse you. And now what they're doing with textbooks, because they're having to deal with conservative people who are responding to many of the textbooks. I deal with a lot of publishers, and they say they have to write in there. They have to give space to the possibility that there will be people who will say, well, no, there's a polygenesis to the origin of the human race. Because there are some white people who don't want to believe that the origin of the human race is Africa. So you have to write the textbooks now and say there are some scientists who believe, there are very few real scientists who believe this, that believe that there may have been simultaneous development of the human species in different parts of the world. You know, you can't, no, there's a monogenetic origin of the human race. And 99% of all the scientists in the world believe that. So why would you have that even in a textbook anymore now? That there's a polygenetic theory. It's not a serious theory. Research from inside the culture. And when we are talking about our curriculum, I think that the study of our children is fundamental to understanding how to educate our children. And this is where the work of Harriet and Asa come in, this work where you look at what's the character of our children? What's the personality? What's the learning styles of our children? What's their background? When you do that, then you come up with this whole notion of research from inside the culture. Let's go to the next one because I'm going to move quite quickly here. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Afrocentric paradigm involving the cosmology, the nature of being, mythology, ontology, which is the nature of being, axiology, the nature of ethical values, epistemology, the nature of knowledge, proofs, methods, aesthetics, the nature of creative motifs. I will deal with any of these in questions and as we go through. So let's just go to the next one. I know my time is short here. Analytical terminology, how do you deal with the question of where a lesson plan is located, or where I'm located, or where a phenomenon is located? You deal with, these are terminologies that have been developed. Place, determination, oriented, disoriented. misoriented, linguistic fallacy, locational fallacy, location, centeredness, center, dislocation, relocation, off center, off location, margin. Now we have little children saying, well, she's just off center today, you know. And they say, well, you know, what's wrong with that kid? Well, they're a little misoriented today. And because what's happening is we're talking about this new language that we ought to have. Someone is focused, coming from a perspective, someone is solid, and so on. And all this is about location. Where are you located? And I can deal with this later on in the question and answer. Next, thank you. Finding agency. This is centering the subject, centering the child. You want to find agency, but you also want to seek to place the student in the center and attach the student to the subject. Whatever that subject is that you're teaching, if you're a good teacher, you try to relate what you are teaching to the student, and you try to bring them together. You try to show that there's a connectedness between that subject and the student. And in every lesson plan that you teach, you can do that. If you take time to do it, you can do it. And if there are any teachers here who have a problem with this and you've got a lesson plan or an idea, you know, whether it's about community or about self or is it about science or what have you, I can show you how you can connect that to students. And then the modeling behaviors, respect for school leaders, for colleagues, for parents, for school property, for ancestors, for holidays, for culture, and respect your own philosophy. Those are the final points that I wanted to make there, and then I want to conclude with a couple of things, and then I'll be finished. The African American Declaration. We believe in education, honoring our scholars and teachers, and demanding of our children and ourselves a rigid code of intellectual curiosity. We believe in quality work and just compensation. We believe in justice and goodwill. We believe in harmony, but are not afraid to struggle for liberation. We believe in charity and generosity. We believe in courtesy and respect for all humans. We believe in ethical ideas and actions. We believe in joy, laughter, and humor. We believe in rhythm with nature and people. We believe in respect for all creations. We believe in excellence in all things. This is our declaration. That's the Declaration of African America. And this is what we believe. And if you look at the African American people, this is essentially what the African American people have always believed. And we have an Afrocentric creed. And I don't know whether Sankofa has. You have the Afrocentric creed here at Sankofa? All right. This is used in a lot of schools. Afrocentric creed, where the child declares, I have faith in myself. I have faith in my teachers. I will accept my duties and responsibilities. I respect others and seek their respect. I have self-respect. I have self-control. I can learn if I study hard. I will learn because I will study hard. I love myself, and loving myself, I will be myself and know myself. I am the one who is talking. And we have in many schools, the children recite this in the mornings before the school starts. So it gives them a sense, I am the one talking. I'm telling you basically, yes. We can get you copies. All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Anna. Now let me just finish with couple points, and then I will be finished. There are several characteristics of the curriculum that I believe that would be necessary in terms of Afrocentric curriculum. In fact, the curriculum is really everything, and I hope that you read the comments that I will have in the little booklet that will be published, because I go more extensively into the curriculum. The curriculum is really everything. It's not just scope and sequences inside the classroom or inside school, but it's also the school building, the way, I mean, this is a part of the curriculum is the environment, part of the teachers are the part of the curriculum. I mean, there are a lot of things go into curriculum, so it's just not the scope and sequences of what's offered in classroom, but characteristics, an intense interest in location determined by symbols, motifs, rituals, and signs, and you already see that here. A commitment to finding the subject place of African people in any lesson plan. Third, a defense of African cultural elements as historically valid in the context of art, music, and literature. Fourth, a celebration of centeredness and agency, and a commitment to lexical refinement that eliminates pejoratives about Africans or other people. And fifth, a powerful imperative from historical sources to revise the collective text of African people. That's what we have to do. And this is part of this development. And that's why, as I said earlier, this is information that I have tried to put together from my mentor, Maulana Karenga, and from Asa, Harriet, from all of you who have contributed to me. But it is this based actually out of the early 1960s with the Kawaii, when I was a student at UCLA, and I heard that the major crisis in the African American community was a cultural crisis. That was Maulana Karenga said that. And that had a great impact on me. From that point on, my idea was, how do you examine this cultural crisis? And how do you resolve this cultural crisis? Afrocentricity was written in 1980 as a statement to help resolve the cultural crisis. That's basically what it was. It was like, well, first thing you got to do is stand up. You know what I mean? African people have to stand up. You have to stand up where you are. You know you have to. It takes a whole new posture. Then you have to have a sense of integrity based on your own history, and always refer from the basis of that. Because the issue, and I will be finished. The issue is this, and this is why Afrocentric curriculum and Afrocentric schools are so important. The issue is that in this country, if you know our history, we have been moved so far off of our own terms that we didn't even have our own names. We didn't even know our names. That's why the Nation of Islam said, where's X? We didn't even know, and we forgot that. Now we act like we forgot what the issue was. That was the issue was that here is a group of people in the history of the world, and one of the few groups of people in the history of the world who are not even operating on their own terms. Don't even have their own religion. Don't wear their own clothes. And in fact, operate on the basis of the European model as if they are European. In fact, sometimes out-European the European. You know, I mean, no, it's true. This is what, I'm telling you, that's the condition we found among our people. How do you deal with that condition? That was the Afrocentric challenge. How do you deal with that? And we all came to the same, now I'm not the only one who came to that analytical place. The African people had come to that analytical place before, and they had given different answers to it. This is what I say in Afrocentricity. I said, you know, when you look back at Garvey, he came to the same place. Elijah, they all came to the same place. How do we deal with this? And what the Afrocentric schools are attempting to do is to start in the first and the kindergarten, pre-K, to get these young people to at least realize who they are, that their culture is significant and valued. Because our children, this is what I believe, our children don't have a problem with self-esteem. They like who they are personally. They like how they walk, how they sing, how they dance, how smart they are, how they play basketball. They don't have a self-esteem problem. And don't let people tell you that Afrocentric curriculum is about trying to help black children have self-esteem. No, that's not our problem. It's not our children's problem. Our children's problem is a lack of collective cultural esteem. Sometimes they don't like being African. And that's because of the society moved them off of African terms. And what we're trying to do is to deal with that, you see. But we're trying to also deal with truth and factual information, because it all has to be related. Well, basically, I have many more things to say, but I know I'm trying to be Afrocentric here. And I'm not going to, I'm not going to do that. Because I haven't told y'all about the 7 elements. No, I haven't. But I'm going to go through them real quick. that's right. You know, in terms of the curriculum, classical foundation, the idea of tradition and innovation, the notion of location and time and space, creation and exchange, which investigates principles of production, distribution, and consumption, politics and power, scientific application, and ethics and values. That's all. Thank you.